Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for what I think will be a very important discussion about what I think Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for what I think will be a very important discussion about what I think is the major issue facing our country and the entire world. Climate change is, in fact, an existential threat to the planet. And I'm delighted that we have with us a really great panel of folks to help us discuss the issue. And at the end of our discussion, we're going to open it up to some of the questions that you have asked. Our guests tonight are Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is the U.S. representative from New York's 14th Congressional District. Alexandria is a grassroots activist. She was the prime author of one of the important environmental pieces of legislation in recent history, the Green New Deal. And we thank her very much for being here and for the great work that she is doing. We're also joined by an old and dear friend of mine, Bill McKibben. And as I think many of you know, Bill has been writing about climate change for a very long time. I think some of his early books were some of the earliest popular books on climate change. He has also been active in helping to form 350.org and has been a leading advocate for the transformation of our energy system. We're delighted also to have with us David Wallace Wells, who is, I think, one of the important authors today regarding climate change. He's the author of a really good book called The Uninhabitable Earth. He's currently an editor-at-large for New York and covers the climate crisis extensively. He also writes a weekly newsletter for the New York Times. We're delighted to have David with us. Last but not least, Sheldon Whitehouse is the U.S. Senator from Rhode Island. And what Sheldon has been doing as chairman of the Budget Committee, I think, is really quite extraordinary. He's been using his position there to talk about the financial implications of climate change and what it will mean for our country and the world. And we're delighted that Sheldon is with us as well. Let me just start off by saying a few words, and I'll give it over to Alexandria, and we'll all say a few words, and then we'll have a discussion and open it up. Here's the simple reality that I think most of us know. Here it is, the reality that the past 8 years have been the 8 warmest years on record. And 2023 is on track to be the warmest year in recorded history. So people tell you they don't believe in climate change. Well, that's the reality. Last week, we experienced the hottest day in recorded history, 4 days in a row. We set the record last Monday, then we broke that record on Tuesday, then we tied that record on Wednesday, and then we broke that record again on Thursday. Each of these days may have been hotter than any day in the last 125,000 years. The ocean waters off the Florida Keys are seeing their hottest temperatures on record, and we're not even in the hottest part of the year yet. These waters are over 90 degrees, which is absolutely devastating for the coral reefs, which underpin the region's entire ecosystems. Heat doesn't just drive extreme weather. Heat kills, according to a new study released on Monday. Last summer's heat waves killed more than 61,000 people in Europe, just in Europe. Last month, the heat index in Corpus Christi, Texas, reached 125 degrees Fahrenheit, close to the highest level at which human beings are able to survive. Right now, more than 50 million people across America, the American South and Southwest, are experiencing extreme levels of heat. Heat is also driving massive and unprecedented forest fires. Alexandria and I are in Washington, D.C. A couple of weeks ago, I don't know if you were outside, just took a walk, which was a big mistake, and the air was disgusting with the smoke coming from Quebec, Canada. And we have seen major cities in America experiencing the hottest days they have ever experienced. So the reality is, not only in America, but all over the world, in China, in India, in Pakistan, in some of the poorest countries on earth, who have no capability of protecting their people from the drought and the floods and the migrations that will take place as a result of climate change. We are looking at a major global crisis. And in my view, if this planet does not get its act together, if we in Congress do not get our act together, the planet that we're going to be leaving our children and future generations will be increasingly unhealthy and uninhabitable. I don't know how many of you saw that movie, a very good movie done by Adam McKay and David Thoreau. Did you see it? And it was called Don't Look Up. And what it was about is this huge meteor that is heading to Earth, and they're saying, it's coming, we got to do something. And because of stupid politics and greed and ignorance, another fact is nothing is done and the Earth is destroyed. We are in a don't look up moment. Folks, the planet is in serious trouble. And if we don't get our act together, the future is not great. And with those optimistic words, let me give it over to Alexandria.
Thank you, Bernie. And, I don't think we can understate the planetary crisis that is not just coming, but that is here. As you mentioned, the hottest 4 days on record happened the 4 hottest days on record all happened last week. And we are simultaneously experiencing one of the hottest summers and one of the hottest years of our lives, which will also be one of the coolest years in our future. We will remember when our summers were just in the high 90 degrees in some regions. And this poses a planetary crisis, a climate crisis, but it is also one that is not going to hit all of us equally. We already see that something known as wet bulb temperatures in the deep south, which means, when humidity goes beyond a certain level, the temperature required to kill a person actually reduces, and a person can die in as little as 95 degrees Fahrenheit when humidity goes beyond a certain level. And the folks who die are folks whose power has been cut out, the folks who don't have access to air conditioning, the folks whose power grids have gone out, as we saw in the Texas freeze, when it comes to all of these phenomena that result from our climate crisis. And that means that the poor and the disadvantaged and frontline communities are the ones that are most endangered in our climate crisis. And all of this is to say is that, when I think oftentimes about the case, and some people ask me about the case for optimism and the case for hope, people say, why shouldn't we give up? And I think the fact of the matter is there's a couple of things that we need to examine here. The first fact of the matter is that we don't have a choice. we live on this planet. It belongs to us. We are here, and we are in control of our destiny. And secondly, it's that while the climate crisis is manifesting as a political and ecological crisis, it is the outcome of human systems. It is the outcome of economic systems, governmental systems. It is the result of corruption. It is the result of our economic system. And that means that it's not a crisis that is natural in its creation. And all things that are of human creation can be changed by human beings. And that means that wherever there is a chance, we have a duty and an obligation to ourselves and to each other to try. And not only are we, and I don't mean trying as just this futile exercise, but people have actually been engaging in organizing that is working and that is starting to stem the tide of all of these problems that are resulting in the climate crisis. In New York, we just passed a historic Build Public Renewables Act after a long, hard-fought battle. There were many entrenched politicians on the state level. Young people started to stand up and they started to say, we're sick of this. They started challenging incumbents across the state of New York. They captured state legislative seats, and then they proceeded to pass one of the most ambitious climate pieces of legislation in the state's history. We also have the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which would not have happened if not for the activists and organizers around both the Green New Deal and environmental organizing across the board. And so we are moving the needle here. And while corruption is still there and that the powers are that we are standing up against are truly no joke, and indigenous organizers and activists around the world are murdered for trying to stand up for the Amazon and standing up against, big oil, we are also seeing that these efforts are not in fact futile, and that there is movement, there is hope. And as long as there are individuals that are present, whether it's anyone tuning into this live stream tonight, whether it's someone that's having a conversation with a family member, wherever there are people that are trying, there is hope and there's rationale for optimism. And, I'm just so grateful to be able to be in this fight with you. And I'm so grateful to be in this fight with all of our guests, along with everyone else who's tuning in, because we're not giving up and we're going to win.
Thank you. Bill McKibben. Bill.
Oh, you're muted, Bill.
Muted.
Thank you very much. You would think after 4 years of Zoom, I'd be better at it. Look, Bernie, Alexandria, thank you enormously. Bernie, you're right. I wrote the first book about all this, what we then called the greenhouse effect. It came out the month that Alexandria was born. That's about how long this has been a public issue in our world. And here's the thing. We knew everything back then that we know now. It's not like there's some surprise. When you burn coal and gas and oil, you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, its molecular structure traps heat. The scientists told us how much it was going to heat up. In fact, the oil company scientists knew exactly how much it was going to heat up too. I will say, surveying the wreckage of our beloved state of Vermont, Bernie, today, that there is exactly no satisfaction in saying, I told you so. It is, in fact, just the opposite, the sense of extraordinary failure in not figuring out how to ward off the greatest challenge that humans have ever faced. We have lost a lot. The temperature is already something like 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, and it's gonna go higher still. Even the next 18 months are gonna be brutal because this El Nino now kicking off is gonna drive the temperature higher than any human civilization has ever dealt with, and we don't know what it's gonna be like except that it'll be violent and chaotic and full of havoc. That said, we're not yet entitled to despair because there is an extraordinary amount that we can do. We also live on a planet where, thanks to the great work of engineers over the last decade, the cheapest way to produce power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That is a remarkable, remarkable change. It means there is no longer a technological or financial obstacle to making truly rapid progress. But that doesn't mean that we will make that progress, because the obstacles that remain, inertia, always a force in human affairs, and vested interest, which in this case is the thing that has thwarted action for the last 35 years. The fossil fuel industry's incredible campaign of denial and delay and deception continues. And Bernie, I don't know about you, but when I look at those flooded streets in Montpelier and things, one of the first things I want to do is have some new legislation that makes the polluters pay for cleaning this stuff up here and in Pakistan and in every other part of the world. And we're still implicated in all of this. I mean, even in our state, Bernie, the state pension fund still invested in the fossil fuel industry. Our friends, Third Act Vermont and things are working hard to change that, and they can use all the help that we can get. But it's time to break the power once and for all of the fossil fuel industry. Remember, the reason that they are fighting so hard is because they understand that the cheapest way to produce power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. And for them, that's the dumbest business model of all time. And they will do whatever they can to thwart it, so we have to stand up to them. And the only way to do that is with organizing. They have the power that comes with money. We have to work in the currency of movements. Now, the thing I've been doing for the last 18 months is this very fast growing work at Third Act. David, Alexandria, I'm afraid you guys are too young to join, but someday you're headed our direction, and when you're over 60, you too can join in this work. We're backing up the young people who've really been leading in this fight. Our friends at the Sunrise Movement and Fridays for the Future and all the other young people who've been doing such great work. Well, there's 70 million of us over the age of 60. We have a lot of power because we all vote. There's no known way to stop old people from voting. And we have most of the money too. So if you want to pressure Washington or Wall Street or Albany, wherever it is, it helps to have some people with hairlines like mine engaged in this fight. It is, and I'll just end here by saying, it is the fight of all time. It's a race. The planet's climate system is deteriorating rapidly. The scientists tell us that we need to cut emissions in half by 2030, which by my watch is 6 years and 5 months away. That's the race. We can do it, but we will only do it if we use that most extraordinary source of energy of all, the energy of people when they come together to demand and to make change. So many, many thanks for doing this tonight.
Okay, well, thank you, Bill. Our next panelist is David Wallace Wells. David, thanks for being with us.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. I just wanted to start by picking up on some things that Bill was saying about this being, the fight of all time. It's also a fight that's where we find ourselves at an incredibly pivotal moment. We are right now right up against this temperature limit of 1.5 degrees, which scientists have often talked about as the highest level of safe warming. Now, we know now more and more every day that it's not so safe. It's not even safe being a little below 1.5 degrees. And one of the scariest features of recent science is how much more intense it seems the impacts are going to be and are already at lower temperatures than were previously predicted. But we're right at that threshold right now, which means we are making decisions that are unbelievably consequential. When Bill wrote his book, 35 years ago, most of these impacts looked quite distant in the future. And now we look outside our windows and it doesn't tell us a comforting message of normalcy, which it used to. Even just a few years ago, it used to tell us that message. Now we look out our windows, we look at our social media feeds, we watch television, we see the crisis here now. And that's not a surprise. At just 1.2, 1.3 degrees of warming, which is where we are now, we are already entirely outside the window of temperatures that enclose all of human history, which means everything we've ever known as a civilization is the result in part of temperature conditions which we have already left behind. And that's why we're seeing heat indices in Miami. It's been 105, I think, for 10 straight days there. We've seen El Paso has had over 100-degree days for weeks on end. We're going to see 120 plus degrees next week in California's Central Valley, where, of course, there will be agricultural laborers trying to work in that heat. And in Texas, where some of the most intense temperatures over the last couple of weeks have been, the governor recently vetoed a bill requiring water breaks for laborers in the midst of an unbelievably intense months plus long heat wave. So it's not just, the opposition of the fossil fuel business. It's also the cruelty of much of our politics that is preventing us from really taking the action we need. This is all at barely 1.5 degrees. And the stakes of how much above that we get are really, really high, which means the stakes of the actions we take today are unbelievably important too. At just 2 degrees, which we're probably likely to hit in a few decades if we don't meaningfully change course, we're talking about, just from the fossil fuel that would be required to produce that extra warming, we're talking about killing globally 150 million additional people from the air pollution that produces. Just think about that. Maintaining the status quo and sticking with the fossil fuel systems that we have is killing about 10 million people a year just through air pollution, putting entirely aside the effects of climate change. And that is the system that we think of as free, that we embrace as the status quo and are afraid of changing too rapidly. That's the system that we're stuck with right now. At 2 degrees, we'd see floods that used to hit once a century, hitting many parts of the world every single year. So these are floods and storm events that used to be recorded in mythology. They were so significant, and they would become annual, if not multiply annual events in many parts of the world. And across South Asia and the Middle East, where some of the world's most densely populated cities are today located, it'll be so hot that during summer, it'll be a struggle to work outside, and for some people even to move around outside, as we've seen over the last couple of years. This is an unbelievable threshold period that we're facing. We are finally taking action thanks to the activists that we've all been talking about and celebrating and applauding, thanks to the action of legislators in places like the US and indeed in certain ways more so around the world. As Bill mentioned, the price of electricity is now such that it is an inarguable proposition that any place will be better off the faster they move rather than the slower than they move. So decarbonization is not a burden, it is an opportunity, and it is a public health opportunity as much as it is an economic opportunity. And yet, we still watch emissions rise every year. And yet, despite the incredible renewable build-out that we've seen over the last few years, the share of global energy produced by renewables still hasn't grown meaningfully in decades. And yet we are still looking out our windows, seeing orange skies, seeing unprecedented floods, and normalizing those events at a rapid clip. We cannot continue behaving that way. We cannot continue producing all this extra carbon. We cannot continue heating the planet further. But finally, we have the tools and political will to make changes that a decade or 2 decades or 3.5 decades ago when The End of Nature came out, we didn't quite have yet. So the time for action is now. The planet is crying out for us, particularly people in other parts of the world who are suffering most are crying out for our aid and our attention and our help. We need to move quickly, and I'm thrilled to be talking about it with all of you tonight.
David, thanks very much. Next panelist is Sheldon Whitehouse, who's chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. Sheldon?
Thanks, Bernie. I think I'll expand a little bit on Alexandria's point about corruption, because the fight for climate safety that we're involved in is also a fight for our democracy. We are where we are. We face the perils that we face because of a massive effort of covert political influence brought on by the fossil fuel industry. And it has some key waypoints. If we start in 2006, when you and I, Bernie, came to the Senate, in that election, grand total outside secret spending in politics, $5 million. Not a great thing, but very manageable. Then comes, and in the Senate, we had multiple bipartisan climate bills kicking around. John McCain, a Republican, ran for president on a good climate platform. Then comes 2010, January 2010, Citizens United. Suddenly it's not 5 million anymore. Suddenly it's unlimited and it's secret. And bipartisanship died the day Citizens United was decided. From then until now, no Senate Republican has gotten on a serious climate bill. And in this last 2020 election, where we have the complete numbers, $1 billion in secret outside money came into that election, 200 times as much as just in 2006. Unlimited money, anonymous money, a highly motivated industry. And what they created was a massive covert political influence operation that not only allowed them to exert immense power, but also to hide their hand behind phony front groups, and in some cases, not even have to spend the money. Because the ability to make threats and promises, once you had the power to spend the money, was enough. And of course, those threats and promises are always going to be very secret. So I think that one of the areas in which we have to make sure we do our work is to expose who did this, dig out the dark money, end it, but also investigate it. And I would love to see the Department of Justice bring exactly the kind of litigation that it won against the tobacco industry for lying about the dangers associated with its product, brought under Clinton, continued under Bush, won in court, upheld on appeal, and the judgment was, tobacco industry, thou shalt lie no more. And when they had to stop lying, everything changed about tobacco. And if the Biden DOJ would give an honest look at that kind of litigation against the lies of the fossil fuel industry, that could be a real turnaround. There are lots of other litigation going on out there, but the DOJ is a big one, and I hope that they make the decision to at least give such a lawsuit an honest look.
Sheldon, thanks very much. What I want to do now, I'm going to get back to Sheldon's point in a minute, because it raises the obvious question that people are asking. What are we going to do? It's good to talk about the problem. What are we going to do about it? And I think Sheldon came up with one interesting point. Before we go further, I was in Vermont today, as Bill mentioned. Our state has just suffered its worst natural disaster since 1927. And I'll tell you something, it's one thing to talk about it, but this afternoon I was walking around the street in Barre, Vermont, mud this high, water in everybody's basements. Whether these houses are salvageable or not, I don't know. Many of these people don't have insurance. It was just horrible. This is one small city in one small state. What I want to do now, before we come back to some of the issues all of us raised, I want to take this discussion internationally. I mean, we heard about what's happening in the United States, in Texas, Florida, Vermont. But guess what? This is not just an American issue. This is a global issue. David, let me throw it to you. Talk a little bit about what climate change is doing all over the world to developed countries, and maybe a special emphasis on some of the poorest countries in the world. What's happening there?
Well, let me start actually by talking about responsibility. So the average American refrigerator produces as much carbon emissions as the average resident of Nigeria. The average resident of Mali produces only as much carbon as the average British tea kettle. We are talking about such unbelievably large, inequalities in terms of responsibility. And as Americans, we should, I think, put that very much at the front of our minds. When we think about historical emissions, the US as a nation is by far the largest historical emitter, and that stuff hangs in the air for centuries or if not millennia, which means no matter what happens, no matter the course of the decarbonization over the next century, we will always be the most responsible party for the damage that has been done to this planet, the United States, number one. But of course, the impacts are unequal too. And they're not only visited upon the global south, but they are most intense there. We're talking about seeing already in sub-Saharan Africa, there are measures suggesting that all across the continent, those countries have lost 20 to 30% of their GDP already because of impacts of climate change, which means they are 20 to 30% poorer than they would be because of the warming that has already happened. And if things really run out of control this century, they may have the very opportunity of growth stripped away from them. We're talking about heat waves now. Last year was in South Asia and Pakistan was considered a completely exceptional, unprecedented heat wave that put hundreds of millions of people under incredibly unhealthy conditions and put millions of people close to the limit of what was considered human survivability. This year, it started earlier and it's already gotten more intense. This is a pattern that we see again and again when we're told something is a 500-year storm and then it comes 5 years in a row. We're seeing, millennia of extreme weather condensed into half a decade. And of course, it's these nations that are least prepared to adapt, but they're also least capable of investing in their own future. And this, I think, is really critical to understand. There's been a lot of movement in the international space, especially over the last couple of years, on questions of justice, and a lot of it revolves around financing. And that is to say, 90+% of the world already lives in places where new renewable energy is cheaper than dirty energy. 90+% of the world. The world's poorest countries are richer in renewable capacity than they are in dirty energy. They have a lot of sun. To some extent, they've got a lot of wind, but they can't actually build the projects that will get them out of the fossil fuel prison because the financing is too expensive and borrowing is too hard for them. They're also wrapped up in debt service for many other reasons to the global north. And so one thing that countries like the United States can do, in addition to, leading by example and taking a much more aggressive hand with industrial policy than we have with the IRA, is to provide much more open and direct financing mechanisms and support so that countries all across the world who know that their citizens would be healthier and more prosperous without dependency on fossil fuels can actually make that leap. At the moment, they can't, but it's almost entirely because of banking and financing decisions, not because their leaders don't want to do it, not because their people don't want it, and not because they would be better off. These are huge, gaping, screaming inequalities that we need to be squaring much more, looking at much more squarely than we have to this point, when we like to tell each other that, well, we're doing better than China, we're doing better than India, therefore we're doing good. First of all, the timeline of climate totally scrambles all that because the damage we did 50 years ago or 100 years ago is still doing damage. But more than that, we owe a huge debt to all of these nations because of the ways that we've scrambled their ecosystems, their agriculture, their ways of life. We have done that, and we owe them a responsibility of helping them get to the other side of it.
Bill or anybody else want to jump in on that, Alexandra?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the international implications, this is also something that we're going to have to contend with on our shores and on our borders as well. This will absolutely, and we are already seeing migration patterns start to shift dramatically, and they will continue to shift dramatically for the rest of our lives due to the climate crisis. Throughout South America and Latin America, the carbon emissions that the United States has disproportionately contributed to is now making a lot of farmland and a lot of communities unable to sustain life in the way that it once did. And those communities are going to migrate. And they're going to migrate in all different sorts of directions, but it is an area where we have to acknowledge not just our financial responsibility, but also our social responsibility. And when we talk about how climate should manifest in our foreign policy, it should become a much more forceful part of our trade agreements when it comes to locking in carbon emissions and bringing them down. But also, one of the things that we have also started to discuss is the possibility of opening up climate refugee visa status and what that would potentially look like in the coming decades. We are seeing increasingly that just as there are humanitarian reasons that people migrate, people will be fleeing climate catastrophe. And these, as David mentioned, it is not the people that are suffering most that contributed most to this. In fact, it is the people that had some of the least amount of carbon emissions and the countries with the least amount of carbon emissions that will have to contend to a certain degree with much of the ramifications of this. And so this is going to be a very real geopolitical issue that we will have to contend with. I know there's discussions as well with other economies and how we can shift out of a mode of conflict to collaboration in how we all realize that this is a planetary crisis that every single one of us will have to contend with.
Bill, you want to jump in on the international situation?
Sure, just a couple of things. One night last week, there were a number of cities in North Africa, up in Algeria, where the minimum nighttime temperature, the temperature only dropped to 103 degrees overnight. That was the highest temperatures like that ever recorded in Africa. All of Africa's put 2% of CO2 into the atmosphere. Not their fault. Excuse me. And we have incredible activists across that part of the world doing all that they can. One of our great leaders, Huang Hong, is in prison tonight in Vietnam because she's been standing up to the coal industry. Senator Merkley just wrote a letter trying to get her out, but we need everybody sort of standing up for the people who are trying to do this work around the world. We can make this transition happen, but David's right. There's a huge surplus of money in things like pension funds in the global north, and we have to have ways to make it possible for that to be invested in this transition across the global south. That's why reform of things like the IMF and the World Bank have been so important, and we've got to keep pushing on that, and the power lies in Washington to make that happen.
So I want to say a word on China. One of the concerns that I worry about a lot is there is a growing effort among Republicans and some Democrats to move us into a Cold War with China, which I think will be a disaster for a number of reasons, not the least of which we need cooperation with China if we're going to address the crisis of climate. They are the largest emitters in the world of carbon. We're the second largest. I think it's a very good sign that President Biden sent John Kerry to China right now, and he is apparently working with his counterparts there on some efforts. Who wants to say a word about China's role in this whole thing and our relationship to China?
Well, I'll pick it up if no one else has. I think for starters, China is responsible for producing the lion's share of all of what we think of as green technology around the world. So at the moment, we are really dependent on their productive capacity. All of the transition that we've observed over the last 5 years and are likely to observe over the next 5 is coming out of Chinese production. And they themselves are on track to produce about half of all renewables built anywhere in the world over the next couple of years. So in the US, China gets targeted a lot, and there are huge problems with that regime. I certainly don't want to minimize it. A lot of the production of that polysilicon and stuff comes from really unbelievably bad, even criminal conditions in Xinjiang. But at the moment, they, despite building coal plants and continuing to do damage in that way, are among the more aggressive actors in the climate stage. And I think as you're suggesting, anything we can do to partner and work with them as opposed to antagonize them is probably going to be a more productive future. In part because, as I said, just for the next few years, the world is not really capable of embarking on a rapid decarbonization program in the next few years without the industrial capacity of China. So much of what has made that energy so cheap comes out of there. And while we might be able to build up that capacity over the course of a decade, right now, it doesn't seem to me to be the time to decouple.
All right, let me go to another issue, picking up on what Sheldon said a few minutes ago. Last year, ExxonMobil made $55 billion in profit. It's a 141% increase from the previous year. Chevron made over $35 billion in profits. Shell made $40 billion in profits. BP made a record-breaking $28 billion in profits. In other words, the fossil fuel industry, in this case, the oil companies, are doing phenomenally well. Business is great. All right, Sheldon, take it away. What are we going to do? They're making all kinds of money. They spend all kinds of money buying and selling politicians. What's your suggestion for
The first thing we need to do is make them pay for the harms of their pollution.
Mhm.
You add up all that money, you could really do a lot of good in the rest of the world, the areas that David and Bill were talking about, but they hoard the money to themselves. And worse, they send in lobbyists to send the Republicans to block us from doing the government's $11 billion to help the rest of the world. It's not enough that they won't help clean up the mess they made. They actually obstruct our government when we tried to step in for them. Whole separate question whether we should step in for them when they're the ones who are at fault here. But their role in this is really bad. And I think, I'm a lawyer, I was a prosecutor. I think you got to get the facts out. You got to expose what took place. And I think you got to get them into a court of law. Look at the good things that have happened in honest courtrooms recently, right? Dominion took down Fox News. E. Jean Carroll got a huge judgment against Donald Trump. The Sandy Hook parents have InfoWars on the run and are probably going to get all their money before it's over. Honest courtrooms can do a beautiful, beautiful job when all you're left with is bullying and politics and the mischief of a big industry.
All right, Bill, you and I chatted about the oil companies. What do you think?
First of all, apologies for the darkness of we're working without power here, but it's proof that batteries will go a long way to get things done. The fossil fuel industry is the root cause of what we're facing. Secretary General of the UN, who has been speaking with remarkable undiplomatic honesty the last year, said not long ago to the oil industry, your core product is our core problem. And he said it is economic and moral madness to continue investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure. But that's what all these guys are doing. Shell Oil 2 years ago at Glasgow said that they were going to start reducing the amount of oil and gas that they pumped by 1 or 2% a year as a sort of beginning modest concession on climate. They took that back earlier this year because they made so much money after Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine that they want to keep making more. And in fact, their CEO was hinting the other day that they might decide to move their headquarters to America because it was so friendly to the fossil fuel industry. Time to make it less friendly to the fossil fuel industry in every possible way. Sheldon's right, and there are communities across this country suing the fossil fuel industry. Multnomah County, where Portland, Oregon's located, just last week filed a $52 billion lawsuit in connection with the heat dome that settled over that part of the world in 2021. I sure hope that somebody in the Attorney General's office in Vermont is hard at work figuring out how we can sue today, because it's not our fault that Montpelier is underwater. It's the fault of the companies that 35 and 40 years ago knew exactly what was going to happen. Exxon scientists calculated with almost perfect accuracy what the temperature was going to be in 2020. And their executives believed them. Exxon started building its drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was in the offing. The only thing they didn't do was tell us. Instead, they ran this scam that cost us the one thing that's most precious in this fight, which is time. That's why we have 6 years, not 36 years, to deal with this problem. And the fact that they're continuing to make money by the bucket load is obscene in every way. There is enormous public support for making polluters pay. Every time people poll about, everybody understands that basic equation. So it's time to push hard there. It won't be enough money to undo the damage. There's not enough money on earth to undo the damage, but it will be a big help, and B, it will slow down the ongoing expansion of this industry, which is a rogue industry if there ever was one. The tobacco industry killed us one smoker at a time. The oil industry's taken us out one planet at a time.
Mhm.
Alexandra, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the degree to corruption is just, it is hard to even wrap our minds around. I serve as the ranking member for the Energy and Mineral Resources Subcommittee on natural resources. And there was this moment not too long ago, it was almost comical, where we had a hearing around fossil fuels and coal and mining. And we had one of the witnesses show up, and I look through, and our team looks through, and the witness was a lobbyist. And we were just flabbergasted, because normally Republicans have historically at least had the decency to try to launder this through a think tank, but they actually called a state fossil fuel lobbyist to testify as a quote unquote expert witness, because that lobbyist also happened to be a former state senator, and was presenting himself as such without disclosing in a forthright manner who he was actually working for. So the extent to which this is a issue of political corruption is very deep and very wide. But I think to what Senator Whitehouse was speaking to, in the potential that this fight has in the courts, is massive. In the Oversight Committee, we held several hearings around exactly what Exxon did, including bringing the CEO of Exxon to testify. And everything that Bill said is completely true. They knew since the 1970s with startling accuracy the exact temperatures that we would be experiencing in the 90s, in the 2000s, etc., decades out. They knew exactly what was going on. They knew their role. They knew their responsibility. And in fact, they contemplated, and their plan A was to be part of a transition, but then they very quickly decided that the cheaper and easier thing to do would be to launch a multi-decade misinformation campaign in the United States and around the world, that their product would not do this. And so just like Big Tobacco, which was held liable for the same exact thing, a very similar pattern of events and facts, Naomi Klein writes very well about this. I think this very similar case can be brought to big oil and the fossil fuel companies in court. And if fossil fuel companies, if they are not part of the solution in paying, when our homes are flooded, or when our homes or when our lands are then succumb to wildfires, we will pay it. Everyday people who lose their homes, people who lose everything, and these fossil fuel companies bear responsibility for what they have done. And it will be and should be the power of a court to compel them to do so. And it would set powerful precedent. New York City has also begun the process of this, and we've also begun the process of divesting our public pensions from fossil fuel companies as well. And we're hoping that many other cities, in addition to those that already have, will follow course.
All right, Sheldon, you
just
Sheldon,
one
as I
fact
recall,
to illustrate the Congresswoman's point about the entrenchment of the fossil fuel industry in the Republican Party. When they did that bill on the debt limit, it was 315 pages long. 275 out of 315 pages were giveaways to the fossil fuel industry.
All right, Sheldon, you are, as I recall, the former Attorney General of Rhode Island, correct?
And Rhode Island has litigation going on right now.
All right, but my question is, all right, as a former prosecutor and Attorney General, these guys have been lying for decades. They are causing, as I think David mentioned or somebody mentioned, far more damage than the tobacco industry, which has only killed many millions of people. Their product now is destroying large parts of the planet. You got a case as Attorney General of the United States to make?
You absolutely do. The first thing you want to do is look at discovery. You want to get their facts and their materials out. If you look at the case against Fox News, the Dominion company won that case before they ever got to trial. They won that case when they got their hands on Fox's emails and documents and caught them telling each other how they were lying about Dominion. In the same way, if you really get into the fossil fuel documents, if you get into their exchanges with their lawyers, if you can get through the crime fraud exception into that, if you can get into their documents with their public relations companies, you can put a case before the American public that will just send them fleeing. The tobacco case was brought as a civil RICO case, which allows enormous discovery. You can even have pre-complaint discovery if you're the attorney general. So there are very powerful tools for the Biden administration to pursue this if they wanted to give it an honest look.
Well, you know what? Sounds to me that maybe we should pay the attorney general a visit. What do you think?
Well, you got to be very careful about that, but
No, I don't think we got to be so careful about it. No, I mean, I think, look,
it is a
I
civil
don't wanna
case.
take this into I mean, I think it's exactly what we should do. I think you indicated we have a case to make. The world is at stake. Politically, I think it's the right thing to do. I think it works politically as well as obviously from a policy perspective. All right, jump in on that issue. What should Congress be doing? Alexandra, you want to say a word on that, or
Yeah.
David, jump in? Or
I mean, while the Inflation Reduction Act was, historic in its investments, it was also far too little. Both things can be true at the same time. And if we view this situation as a one and done situation, we will not come anywhere close to what we need to do. We are talking about historic, federally driven industrial policy that creates millions of jobs in this country that are dignified, higher paid, and better off than jobs in the fossil fuel industry. That's going to be a major part of this transition. We have to pursue broad protections for frontline communities that have both been poisoned, but also have been destroyed from the climate crisis. And we also have the good part is that whereas years ago, we didn't really have the scientific solutions in front of us as to how to fully tackle this issue, we now have insight and technology that we did not have at the beginning of this fight that can now be implemented at a scale that is necessary. And what it is going to take is broad, large, historic investment. And it needs to be fast, it must be deployed quickly, and it also must include civic mobilization, which was part of that work in us working on the Civilian Climate Corps, where we can put millions of young people to work as well, in really transforming this crisis into what could be one of the biggest economic, social, and political mobilizations that can actually create opportunities for everyday working class people.
All right, Bill, can you pick up on what Alexandria said? I mean, you were mentioning before, I think David as well, that in almost all parts of the world, solar is now cheaper than dirty fuel, correct?
Absolutely.
All right, give us some example of what, not only solar, wind, other battery technology, what exists. Tell us what a sane world would look like in 10 years if we moved aggressively right now.
Well, I mean, in 10 years, we'd be running the planet on far more energy from heaven than from hell. The good Lord hung a large ball of burning gas in the sky, and we know how to make full use of it. We catch its rays on photovoltaic panels. We take advantage of the fact that it differentially heats the earth, producing the wind that turns those turbines. And now we have the batteries to store that power when the sun goes down or the wind drops. There's not some miracle technology that we're waiting for. This is the miracle technology. And we can go ahead and use it. But the reason we're not is more than anything else, that political power we've been talking about. And it's, it lies in everybody, but to some degree, it's really important to do things like tell the administration, do not approve this line of LNG export terminals along the Gulf Coast, because all that does is lock us into another few decades of using fracked gas here and around the world. We don't need it. The only people who need it are the investors in the fossil fuel industry who want to access those trillions of dollars in reserves. But for the rest of us, it's far, far better deal in every way, including the fact that sun and wind are available everywhere. Coal and gas and oil are in scarce deposits, which means that the people who control those end up with too much power. In our country, that's the Koch brothers were our biggest oil and gas barons. They purchased one of our political parties and they degrade and deform our democracy. In Europe, the biggest oil and gas baron's Vladimir Putin. He's used his winnings to launch a land war in Europe in the 21st century. That's crazy. We can cut these guys off. And in the process, if we stop burning stuff, 9 million people a year die on this planet from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. That is 1 death in 5. And they're entirely unnecessary because we don't need to be burning that stuff anymore. Those are the kids, hundreds of thousands of them in this country every year, coming down with childhood asthma because of, and then you know who they are. You know who lives next to highways and next to refineries and all of that. These are the stakes here. And it's all about that fight with the fossil fuel industry. We don't.
David, did you want to jump into that?
Just a couple of things to underline what's just recently been said. Bill mentioned 9 million people a year globally dying from the burning of fossil fuels through air pollution. That same study found in America, it was 350,000 Americans every single year. That's the equivalent, that's the same number of people who died in the first year of the pandemic, dying every single year in our country because of fossil fuel pollution. The complete cleanup of our electric grid would be entirely paid for through the public health benefits of cleaner air. We don't even have to worry about the jobs. We don't have to worry about the climate impacts, although those are huge and appreciable too. All we have to do is say, will we be better off if we do this just in a dollars and cents way? We will be more prosperous with a cleaner grid than we would be without it. And I think in terms of legislative priorities, the thing that seems most important and exciting to me is that we find a way to prioritize an aggressive green build out. At the moment, we seem to be debating about continuing to move slowly with infrastructure build out or making a deal with the bad guys. And I think we need to find a path forward that allows us to move very quickly and aggressively only on the things that are going to help us live cleaner and better lives, not the stuff that's going to continue to poison us and poison the planet.
All right, let's jump to some of the questions that came in. Let me start with a question from Elizabeth. I'm reading about half of her question. And she raises a very important issue. How do we convince the non-believers that this is a huge issue? Are there Republicans who do think it's an issue and can convince their counterparts? In other words, look, let me broaden that question. Has the reality that people are experiencing every day in hotter temperatures, in breathing filthy air from Canada, in seeing their lakes dry up, has this changed the American attitude or understanding of climate change? Are more and more people understanding that we're in a crisis right now? Bill, you want to jump in on that one?
The polling data is pretty clear that over the last few years, there's been a dramatic shift in the direction of Americans understanding that we're in danger and wanting government to go to work. At a certain point, enough fires, enough floods, who are you going to believe? Fox News or your own lying eyes, Mm-hmm. And we're at that point. The last 30% of people aren't going to be convinced because they're not waiting for another study and, geophysical research letters. They're ideologically opposed to action. Don't worry about it. The 70% of people who understand we have a problem are enough if we can get them more and more activated. And across the political spectrum, people do like solar panels. I think they poll extraordinarily high among Republicans, Democrats, and independents for different reasons, I think. I think conservatives think, well, I've got a solar panel on my roof. My house is now my impregnable castle. I think liberals are like, the groovy power of the sun is, networking us all in this, whatever. We can work with differences like that. Those are ways forward and through, I think.
Well, I agree with you. That's why I put $7 billion into the Inflation Reduction Act to make it easy for working class people to get the money they need to put solar on their rooftops.
Okay, brag, Bernie.
A little bit.
All right, politics. Sheldon, what's your sense? Rumor has it you're a politician. You try to get votes. Do you sense that there's more growing consciousness about the crisis?
Yeah, I think, our Republican friends don't much listen to the public, certainly not to any public that hasn't been indoctrinated by Fox News, but they listen a lot to business leaders and to the big corporations. And we're experiencing, I think, a bit of a transition. If you look at our witnesses that we brought into the Budget Committee to share warnings about what climate change was going to do to us, the lead witness on the warnings about a coastal property values crash was the chief economist of Freddie Mac, the big mortgage company. We had bipartisan witnesses on the risk of property value crashes in wildfire areas because that risk is unmanageable. The risk to insurance markets was testified about by a leading consultant from Milliman, the big consulting firm for the insurance industry, and the president of Aon, one of the world's biggest insurance companies. And the problem of the carbon bubble exploding and the risk of all of that was testified to by Bob Litterman, the former head risk manager of Goldman Sachs. So little by little, that's going to start to have an impact on our Republican friends because they go to them for money, they go to them for direction. And to date, corporate America has been a disaster, as you know, and as the Congresswoman knows as well. They've been a disaster in Congress. They don't show up to help. If anything, at best, they don't show up at all. And at worst, they show up in the pocket of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to oppose climate legislation. So that shift, I think, will move Republicans a lot. And it may get some of the corporate sector to knock off their own bad climate political behavior.
David, you sensing any change in consciousness regarding climate?
I do, and I think that the money that's coming out of the IRA is playing a big role there. It's going in really disproportionate ways to red states and red districts, and you're already seeing it have a political effect. There was recently a fight in the Texas state legislature where some conservatives were trying to basically kick renewables out or kneecap renewables. And, it's a complicated fight, back and forth. But in the end, they were defeated by other conservatives who knew that doing so would raise the cost of energy in the state. And so you have in the caricature of the American fossil fuel, Texas is the heart of that. You have, first of all, conservatives trying to fight what would otherwise be market trajectories that favor renewables, and then losing in part because of the opposition of their fellow conservatives. Now, that's not happening enough. Those fights are going on in far too many states, and the fights against ESG and all those lawsuits, there's still an enormous amount of opposition there. But 5 years ago, that fight in Texas would not have been won by the renewable side. It would have been won by the fossil fuel side. And I think that we are slowly but surely seeing the tides turn there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let me read a question from Javier. And maybe we can end on this note. I'm going to give it over to Alexandria to respond. And I suspect that I can tell you, I go to a lot of high schools in Vermont, and I talk to a lot of the kids. And if anybody thinks that climate is not on their minds, you would be very, very mistaken. Many of them look into the future and they're saying, what kind of future we can have? And Javier writes, why should we keep trying? Isn't the change we have made already gone too far? Alexandra, you want to deal with that?
It's a question that I get a lot too. And when I do a lot of organizing, especially with young people, just the terror that a lot of people feel about their future and the uncertainty, the younger you are, the more you will see in this lifetime in terms of the violence that will, that will be unleashed by the climate crisis. And so I often hear this: what is the point of trying? Is any of this going to do anything? And actually, I think, David, your book was spoke to this really beautifully, because you spoke about how in the process of writing your book, you were expecting a child, and how you had to wrestle with what you're an expert in and what you're writing a book about, and also the monumental decision to raise a person in this world. And I know so many young people, my friends, feel this dramatic moral weight to this decision. My family, myself, everybody. I really feel like, especially millennials and younger, not only do we just think about the financial and, all of the other logistical things about choosing to have a child, but also seeing this future that we would be raising a generation in. And to that piece, in your book, David, you talked about there's a spectrum of possibility. The climate crisis is not a switch that turns on and certainly will not turn off. But we are talking about how bad the future can get, but also how contained this crisis can be. And the difference in that spectrum is our choices, what we choose to do, who we choose to vote for, how we choose to organize, how we choose to act and be radical as well in forcing and jostling our systems. It's not just about, are we too late? We're never beyond hope. We are never beyond despair. It is about what in the spectrum of possibility would we land on? But beyond that, I think also in terms of a personal purpose, I think a life of having given up is not a life at all. We have an obligation to fight. And it is personal, it is systemic, it is global, but living our lives just acquiescing to the powers that be when they are so few. They are so few. We are talking about a handful of people in this country that are responsible for this, and their power can seem insurmountable. Ursula Le Guin has a quote about that and about capitalism, but it's like, sometimes it can seem insurmountable, but so did the divine right of kings. And any human problem can be solved with human solutions. And I think about the Wizard of Oz, right? I think about even when I sought out to run for office, and it was this absolutely impossible, ludicrous endeavor that some waitress with no money could challenge an extremely powerful person with millions of dollars. And on paper, it would never work. But I kept telling the story about the Wizard of Oz, right? You just kind of have, at the end of the day, there's this guy behind a curtain, and he projects this very big, large, looming figure. And everyone is so terrified in the Emerald City of this big supernatural figure that they all stay in line until the man behind the curtain is exposed and you realize truly how limited he is. And that is what the aristocratic class in this country is. That is what the oligarchy is. It seems so insurmountable. It commands our media. It commands so much of our political structure. But when we see it for what it is, and when we see each other for what we are, and when we see the power that we ourselves hold, the man behind the curtain is revealed. And I truly believe in our heart of hearts that working and creating the conditions, we cannot predict the moment when it happens, right? But we continue to create and contribute to conditions, and all of a sudden moments happen, like the Arab Spring or nuclear disarmament in the 1980s or the fall of apartheid. These moments happen because everyday people, oftentimes feeling like they were pursuing efforts that were futile, enough of them started to do it that our systems changed overnight, even though it was 10, 20, 30 years in the making.
Thanks. Thank you for all that you're doing to inspire millions of young people. Bill, question, and I know the answer, but a lot of people feel there is no hope. Is there hope?
Yeah. There's not hope that we're going to stop global warming. We're in trouble, and that trouble is going to get worse. But there remains hope that we can stop it short of the point where it cuts civilization off at the knees. That's going to take all of us working. And to go to what Alexandria was saying, I get those emails every day from kids saying, young people saying, is it all right for me to have a child or not? Nobody should have to be asking that kind of question. The most important thing, I think, for young people is for all of us to make sure that they do not feel abandoned in this work, that we're not just leaving it up to them, it's up to the next generation to solve this. I mean, that's ridiculous. We got ourselves into this mess. It's time for us to do the work to get us out of this mess. It's doable work. It's not, but it has to happen fast. This is a timed test. Dr. King used to end his speeches by saying, and I think he was quoting from the Massachusetts abolitionist Theodore Parker, say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, i.e., this may take a while, but we're going to win. Well, the arc of the physical universe is short, and it bends toward heat. And if we do not win this soon, then we won't. That's why the urgency is so important. This is the race. And it is, the last time we faced anything like this existential crisis, it was the rise of fascism in Europe in the last century, when our parents and grandparents had to cross the Atlantic and kill or be killed in order to deal with it. We don't have to kill anybody, and we don't have to die in order to do this, but we have to bring the same kind of intensity and focus and willingness to really push, because we have the most important task any humans have ever had in front of us, and we've only got a little while to do it. That's both a burden and an honor and a privilege to get to be a part of that. So thank you guys enormously for all the leadership here. It really, really counts.
David, what do you tell young people about the future, and is there hope?
Well, I think about this as someone who got alarmed about climate change 5 or 6 years ago, started working on it seriously only then, at a time when one could look back at decades of environmental activism like Bill has done, and wonder where it had gotten us, and wonder how hard it was going to be, and despair about how hard it would be to really make progress from that point forward. But 5 years ago, Congresswoman, you hadn't been elected to Congress. We weren't talking about a Green New Deal. We had never heard of Greta Thunberg. We had not heard of Fridays for Future. We had not heard of Sunrise. And really, it is the youth activists of the world who I find most inspiring on this point, because as someone like me looking at the power structure and despairing 5 years ago, I can now look around the world and see hundreds of people who are much farther from power than I was, who are much more disenfranchised, much more marginalized. Many of them are not of voting age, even in countries when they're where they're living in democracies. They're often ethnic minorities. They're LGBTQ youth. They are about as far from the halls of global political power as you could possibly imagine. And over the course of a few years, simply by refusing to be silenced, they made their voices heard and have changed the entire course of climate geopolitics all around the world. And you now have, it may be empty rhetoric, but every powerful person everywhere in the world is talking about climate change now. Every national government is worrying about their climate future. They may not be doing it enough. They may not be doing it fast enough. They're not doing that, making those investments large enough. That is all true. But we are in we're playing an entirely different game now than we were just 5 years ago. And it's because people at every level of society, but especially the ones who are farthest from the levers of power, have refused to accept their fate in that position, insisted on being heard, and insisted on a kind of a moral authority to speak to the world's conscience, which they have done. And the world is finally starting to listen. Because of that, and because of some other innovations too, we're not heading for a future of 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, probably. We're probably heading for a future of 2.5 or 3 where we are now. And if we can do a lot better than that still. But if we've managed in those 5 years, in part because of that energy and that activism, to cut in half our expected warming in 5 years, just think about what we would accomplish in the next 5 years or the next 50 years, because we're probably going to have to be working on it for that long too. But the fight is not hopeless. I think the last few years, the years that I've observed most closely, most up close, tell me that a lot can be done. We're just starting from a very dark place and working our way out of that hole.
Sheldon, what do you say to the young people?
The battle for climate safety is a battle for democracy. It's a battle for the soul of America against a corrupt oligarchy that's trying to entrench itself. It's a fight worth having. It's a fight worth having, win or lose. And there's a real chance, a better than even chance, that we actually win it if we throw ourselves into it in a dedicated way. I think there was a great line in maybe To Kill a Mockingbird where Atticus is talking to Scout about courage and says something like, you got to get into fights when it's the right fight to have, even if you know you will never win. And then often you do.
Mm-hmm.
Or as Nelson Mandela said, everything is impossible until it happens.
Mm-hmm.
Look, let me first of all thank our great guests. I want to thank all of you for the work you're doing on what in fact is the most important issue facing our country and the world. To the viewers out there, thanks very much for joining us. And as I think you have heard everybody say, you don't have the right to give up. Because this is not just about you, this is about your kids and the little kid down the block and your grandchildren. You don't have the right.
Mm-hmm.
And as you heard people say, we are making change. Are we making it fast enough? Absolutely not. But sometimes when people's consciousness reaches a certain level, things happen, and they happen very, very quickly. I think when Sheldon and I came into the United States Senate, there was one woman in the Senate. I think Barbara Bukowski was the only woman, right? All right. And that world has changed because of the grassroots activism of people all over this country. Alexandria is right. You got a small number of people. They are incredibly wealthy. They are incredibly powerful. We outnumber them 1,000 to 1. And our job is to bring our people together. People who want a decent planet for their kids and future generations. And when we do that, not only can we save the planet, we can do extraordinary things with all of this new technology that is being developed. So the note from here is, don't give up. We can turn this thing around. Let's save the planet. Thank you all very much for joining us.